The June 2013 Egyptian protests, also called June 30th Revolution, were mass protests that occurred in Egypt on the 30th of June 2013, marking the one-year anniversary of Mohamed Morsi's inauguration as president. The events ended with 2013 Egyptian coup d'état after millions of protesters across Egypt took to the streets and demanded the immediate resignation of the president. The rallies were partly a response to Tamarod, a grassroots movement that launched a petition in April earlier that year calling for the government to step down, and it claimed to have collected more than 22 million signatures. The number of protesters was estimated to be 14 million, to be the biggest protest in Egypt's history, according to military sources that claimed to have counted the numbers through helicopters that scanned the demonstrations' perimeters across the country. Reasons for demanding Morsi's resignation included accusations of increasing authoritarianism and his pushing through an Islamist agenda disregarding the predominantly secular opposition or the rule of law. The uprising concluded 7 months of protests that started when the Morsi government issued a highly controversial draft constitution that gave him sweeping unlimited powers over the state's judicial system. The demonstrations, which had started peacefully, turned violent when the headquarters of the Muslim Brotherhood were stormed in Mokattam in Cairo and when 5 members of the organization were killed amid clashes. At the same time, many Morsi supporters staged a relatively smaller rally in Rabaa al-Adawiya Square in Nasser City, a district of Cairo. A total of 16 people were reported to have lost their lives on Sunday and approximately 200 injured as of late Tuesday during the unrest as a result of clashes between pro- and anti-Morsi demonstrators, according to the state-run news agency. Another 10 people were also reported to have been killed in the cities of Alexandria, Marsa Matruh and Minya on the 1st of July, amid the chaos the country was facing. The military delivered a nationwide TV and radio statement giving both the government and the opposition a 48-hour ultimatum to resolve the political crisis and meet the people's demands, or it would intervene to restore order. The following day, Morsi delivered an evening speech where he declared his rejection of the declaration, claiming he was the elected president who represented the will of the people. The same day, another statement was released on the official Facebook page of the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces titled "The Final Hours," that read, "We swear by God that we are ready to sacrifice our blood for Egypt and its people against any terrorist, extremist or fool." On the night of the 3rd of July, General Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, head of the Egyptian Armed Forces, announced in a live televised address that Mohamed Morsi had been deposed and replaced by the head of the Constitutional Court Adli Mansour, and that the constitution had been suspended. Morsi was immediately detained and kept under house arrest at the Republican Guard headquarters in Cairo, while several other government officials and Islamist figures supporting Morsi were also arrested. The move was widely deemed as a revolution, and it marked a turning point for the country's future and for the fate of the Muslim Brotherhood, as it was designated a terrorist group later that year in response to a bombing in Mansour and was subjected to an unprecedented crackdown amid an ongoing Islamist unrest. A crackdown by the military on the sit-in at Rabaa al-Adawiya Square led to the August 2013 Rabaa massacre, which Human Rights Watch says led to the deaths of 817 people in Rabaa itself and 904 people across the country by the end of August 14. 10 members of the security forces were also killed. Etymology: the events are also widely called the June 30th Revolution or simply 36th Revolution by the Egyptian and Middle Eastern media. They are also referred to as the Second Egyptian Revolution by several international media outlets. The Tamarod movement's highly successful goal to mobilize the protests is also strongly associated with the naming of the uprising, and some organizations like the Washington Institute for Near East Policy dubbed it the Tamarod Revolution. Background. Amid growing anger towards the regime, President Hosni Mubarak, whose reign was marked by increasing corruption and authoritarianism, resigned on the 11th of February 2011 following 18 days of mass protests that marked the beginning of a new era of political instability in Egypt. The subsequent transitional period, which saw the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces taking power under Field Marshal Mohammed Hussein Tantawai immediately after Mubarak's ouster, saw renewed deadly clashes and human rights abuses. A round of elections started to take place in the country, starting with the 2011 referendum, in which a majority approved of reforms drafted by a military-formed committee. The election, however, proved to be highly controversial despite some positive reforms such limiting the president's time in office to 2 4-year terms. Many opposition figures and activists were upset with the reforms as they were drafted in just 10 days and were offered to the public for only 3 weeks before the referendum. Leading figures such as Mansour and Mohammed El-Baradei wanted a new constitution to be drawn up from scratch before any elections are held, which would have occurred in case of a no vote. However, 2 of the country's largest political forces back then, the Muslim Brotherhood and remnants of the former National Democratic Party, have endorsed the reforms. This turnout proved highly beneficial for the Brotherhood in the following months as they achieved nearly all of their political ambitions, including a majority win for the Islamist current in the 2011-12 parliamentary election, during which the Brotherhood was accused by many opposition figures of making deals with the military while protesters were being killed by security forces. Their efforts culminated with Mohamed Morsi winning against Ahmed Shafik by 51.7% in the 2012 presidential election. Constituent Assembly of 2012 in April, a couple of months prior to Morsi's inauguration. The Administrative Court suspended a Constituent Assembly previously appointed in March without giving any clear reasons for this decision, and which the Brotherhood claimed was politically motivated. In mid-June, however, another 100-member assembly was officially selected a week after a deal was reached between the ruling military council and representatives of 22 parties. Tensions later resumed after a court ruled that the entire Islamist-dominated parliament was illegally elected and ordered the body to dissolve, which angered the Brotherhood, and Mohammed Beltagi called it a full-fledged revolution. On the 18th of June, the SCAF issued a supplementary constitutional declaration that limits the to-be president's power over the military and gives it complete control over all army decisions. However, those controversial moves never changed the status of the Constituent Assembly, as it was elected by the Shura Council, not by Parliament. Also, the same day the military delivered its statement, Hassam El-Geriani was elected as chairman of the Assembly. Military Chief Mohammed Hussein Tantawai was forced to retire by Morsi on the 12th of August. A month and a half after the latter was elected, and a week after a militant attack in Sinai that had the military preoccupied, leaving the Constituent Assembly's drafting process unchallenged. Morsi's declaration and aftermath. Tamarod campaign. A political roadmap proposed by Tamarod announced in a press conference a week before the uprising. 1. Hand power to an independent prime minister who represents the January 25 revolution on the condition that he does not run in the first upcoming presidential or parliamentary elections. 2. The independent prime minister will head a technocratic government whose main mission is to put together an urgent economic plan to save the Egyptian economy and to expand social justice policies. 3. The head of the High Constitutional Court would be assigned the duties of the president according to protocol, where all executive powers are assigned to the prime minister in a 6-month transitional period that ends by presidential elections judicially supervised and monitored internationally, followed by parliamentary elections, he added. 4. Dissolving the Shura Council. Suspending the current constitution and drafting a new constitution are steps in the roadmap proposed by the newly founded Front. 5. The Prime Minister will give the National Defense Council the authority to fulfill its national security responsibility towards the country. Mohammed Abdelaziz, Tamarot co-founder. Amid a climate of dissent and division, Tamarot, a grassroots movement, was founded in April 2013 by 5 young activists with ages ranging between 22 and 30 years old. They orchestrated a door-to-door, street-level campaign collecting signatures from Egyptians across the country calling for, among other demands, President Morsi's resignation, early presidential elections and the start of a renewed constituent process. Tamarod was supported by various opposition parties and autonomous social movements. The campaign, a reminiscent of 1919's collection of petitions against British occupation, called for massive protests all over the country on 30 June 2013, which was the first anniversary of Morsi's inauguration, to create popular pressure on the government to see through their demands. The campaign's leading members Mahmoud Badr, Hassan Shahan, Mohammed Abdelaziz, Maiwa Bar and Mohammed Haikal, initially unfamiliar to the public, started to continuously gain strong popularity among Egyptians, reflected in the people's eagerness to publicly register their names, identification card numbers and signatures on the petition form. The movement was also intensifying its political activity, uniting all anti-brotherhood parties and most political factions in its mission. Among the groups supporting it were the National Salvation Front, the Kefaya movement and the April 6 Youth Movement. These also included members of the former National Democratic Party who, as stated by Mohammed El-Baradei, were allowed to participate as long as they weren't convicted of any crimes such as Morsi's 2012 rival candidate Ahmed Shafik, who supported the protests. On June 26, Tamarod launched the 30th of June Front to administer the upcoming protests and to manage the transitional period following Morsi's ouster. This was in collaboration with a number of political movements and parties. Founders included Ahmed Dauma, former member of the April 6 movement, as well as youth activists such as Esraa Abdel Fattah. According to the roadmap offered by the Front, the head of the Supreme Constitutional Court will be the acting interim president and all executive powers would be handed over to a new prime minister. The demands also included the suspension of the 2012 Constitution, the dissolution of the Shura Council and forming a committee of experts to draft a new constitution and put it to a referendum. At the press conference where the Front was announced and in the presence of many prominent revolutionary and political figures, Mohammed Abdelaziz, co-founder of the campaign, said, "We announced the 30th of June Front as an initiative from Tamarod to represent Egyptians who refuse Muslim Brotherhood rule and to share with the great Egyptian people their political vision in order to avoid the mistakes of the past period and to continue on the path of January 25 revolution." However, the presidency and its supporters had a different reaction to Tamarod, which was far from appeasing the population. A counter-campaign called Tag Erad was started by Al-Gamar al-Islamiyya member Assem Abdul Majid, who called on Morsi's supporters to sign this petition to keep the legitimately elected president in his post. Abdul Majid's campaign, however, proved unsuccessful in terms of impact compared to Tamarod, which was able to penetrate and mobilize the Couch Party, the silent majority of Egyptians who usually avoid participating in political events but prominently joined anti-Morsi demonstrations this time. The movement's effectiveness in sparking the uprising directly inspired many other copycat campaigns throughout the Arab world such as Gaza, Morocco, Tunisia and Yemen, as well as a new wave of protests in Bahrain. Allegations of previous military involvement. Egypt's military has long showed discontent at Morsi's policies and viewed the political tensions between the government and its opponents as a threat to the nation's stability. This had come to light following a huge Islamist rally in support of the Syrian uprising sponsored by the Brotherhood in Cairo Stadium. The conference was meant to warn those hoping to push Mohamed Morsi out of office. and was aimed at forging stronger ties with extremist Islamist groups. Morsi shocked the nation then by cutting diplomatic ties with Syria and by remaining silent while hardliners were calling for jihad to combat the Syrian government and Shiite fighters, and when they were using sectarian speech towards Shiite Muslims. What worried the army, though, is that Morsi, while not explicitly calling himself a holy war, delivered a speech in which he called for a foreign intervention against Bashar al-Assad's government by establishing a no-fly zone over Syria. The military responded by issuing a statement where it argued that its only role is to guard Egypt's borders. On the 23rd of June, General Abdel Fattah el-Sisi issued a statement warning all sides, saying that the army will not allow the country to fall into a dark tunnel of conflict. He also added, "Those who think that we are oblivious to the dangers that threaten the Egyptian state are mistaken. We will not remain silent while the country slips into a conflict that will be hard to control." After Morsi was ousted on July 3, most of the country's energy crises, that were very common during Morsi's presidency, were surprisingly diminished following the revolution. David D. Kirkpatrick, Cairo's bureau chief of the New York Times, claimed there might have been a campaign orchestrated by members of the old Mubarak regime and top military generals that was meant to undermine Mohamed Morsi's one-year rule. The reason for this belief is that state agencies responsible for providing electricity and ensuring gas supplies failed so fundamentally, so gas lines and rolling blackouts fueled widespread anger at the government. Kirkpatrick also claimed that a smear media campaign against Morsi, that began immediately following Morsi's inauguration, helped feed popular discontent towards the authorities by adopting a contradictory stance through favoring the military while honoring Morsi's position as President of the Republic. Issues: economic crisis preparation and security precautions. During security measures in Upper Egypt, the Luxor Security Directorate announced that it had transferred all those jailed in the local police station to Kunar prison as a mean of avoiding the 2011 scenario due to the risk of violence. Aswan saw heavy security presence, and the police chief announced that he will personally head the operation room to receive complaints and information during the demonstrations, and said that security personnel will protect their stations as well as state property, and added that the people will be protected, not the regime or any political party. Members of the FJP have gathered in front of their party headquarters to secure the complex. These procedures took place on June 30, the day of protests. According to information that came out after the removal of Morsi, officials claimed that Morsi stopped working at the presidential office as early as June 26 in anticipation to the protests and moved with his family to Kubbeir Palace, just a few blocks away from the main palace. Fears of violence against Copts. Weeks prior to the protests, Coptic Christians, particularly in Upper Egypt, received threats from Morsi's Islamist supporters, pressuring them not to take part in the protests. Sheikh Essam Abdulhamid, a member of Parliament's Shura Council, said in an interview on television that Christians should not participate in the protests and warned them, "Do not sacrifice your children, since the general Muslim opinion will not be silent about the ousting of the president." Letters were delivered to Christian families in Minya where they were threatened not to join the protests. Otherwise their businesses, cars, homes, schools, and churches might catch fire. The letters, signed by people zealous of the nation, read, "If you are not worried about any of these, then worry about your children and your homes." This message is being delivered with tact, but where the moment of truth comes, there will be no tact. There have been incitements against Copts by some of Morsi's staunchest allies such as Al-Gamma al-Islamiya's leading Hardline cleric Assem Abdul Majid directly threatened the country's Christian community by saying, "If you go down into the streets on the 30th of June, you will bring black days onto yourselves." President Mohammed Morsi himself invited Pope Tawadros II to a meeting at the country's presidential palace in what has been seen as an attempt to put pressure on him, while the Pope told Morsi to do what is necessary to bring the nation together and work for the peace of Egypt, not to stir up quarrels. "I am still hoping to see improvements in the economic and social life of the country," he said. While Morsi suggested that the church should advise Egypt's Christian community not to participate in the protests, another pro-Morsi cleric Safwat Higazi addressed the country's Christians by saying, "You share this country with us, but there are red lines. And one red line is the legitimacy of Dr. Morsi."